We traveled to Lear County, and it was there that we crossed over just by a mile or two into rebel territory. And a man approached me. He started describing the horrendous violence that had happened. He said government soldiers came in to their village and killed his 5-year-old child and forced him to eat some of her body.
That's Jane Ferguson, a journalist who was just in South Sudan, covering a famine that's left about 100,000 people starving and 5.5 million more at risk. She was here in Unity, a state where the UN officially declared a famine in February 2017. It's also where the worst violence in South Sudan's 4-year civil war has taken place, and that's not a coincidence. The violence has destroyed crops and markets and has forced people to flee. As a result, there's no food. In the past, humanitarian aid has been the best solution for famines, but today, the South Sudanese government is blocking access to much of the country in an attempt to starve the rebels. It's why South Sudan's famine is man-made. And so are the 3 other famines developing in Nigeria, Somalia, and Yemen. Wars in these 4 countries are threatening to starve 20 million people.
No one country is the same, no one conflict is the same, but what we are seeing are some very dangerous patterns. The use of food, or the lack thereof, as a weapon.
Fighting groups in each country have created food shortages to starve each other. South Sudan became an independent country in 2011, but fell into civil war just 2 years later. It started as a personal rivalry between President Salva Kiir and former Vice President Riek Machar, but with each leader belonging to a different ethnic group, it soon became a tribal conflict.
What we're seeing now is this war almost cannibalizing, where it's disintegrating into smaller and smaller groups across the country. What we saw when we got there was clear evidence of ethnic cleansing.
The government has blocked humanitarian aid to parts of rebel territory, leaving millions of civilians trapped without access to food. And it's created chaos. The fighting has forced tens of thousands to leave their homes, often for the dense marshlands that surround cities.
It's such a good hiding place, but it's also a place where people starve to death. They have no means of finding food.
There's a similar situation in Nigeria, where the government's been fighting the Islamist militant group Boko Haram since 2009. The terrorist group controls large portions of Borno State, and it's responsible for mass killings, suicide bombings, and kidnappings in the region. Their violent tactics have displaced nearly 2 million people and collapsed the agricultural economy. The Nigerian government restricts aid to keep supplies from reaching Boko Haram territory, where civilians continue to be at risk of starvation. Over in Somalia, another al-Qaeda-linked terrorist group, Al-Shabaab, controls at least 10% of the country. Getting aid to those areas has proven difficult as well. Back in 2011, during the last famine, the group killed aid workers and looted supply trucks. Now a drought has recreated famine conditions in Somalia, and limited access to humanitarian aid has made the situation worse. This time, Al-Shabaab claims it will allow people to move and find aid, but if they don't, millions will be trapped without food again. The clearest example of a man-made famine is just north of Somalia, in Yemen. Civil war broke out in 2014 between the government and a rebel group called the Houthis. They've received weapons, personnel, and support from Iran. In response, Saudi Arabia, Iran's rival in the Middle East, intervened in 2015 on behalf of the government. It began bombing Houthi territory, but also roads, bridges, and ports to block Iranian supplies. Saudis also set up a naval blockade that keeps 85% of the food supplies out of Yemen. Meanwhile, in the interior, 7 million people are at risk of starvation. Yemen's food shortage is caused by an internal conflict, but it's controlled by the geopolitics of the region. This makes man-made famines incredibly hard to solve.
So if it comes down to simply trying to save lives, that is something that's easy to do, unless you cannot get access, unless there are warring sides who are trying to push hunger deliberately on people, and unless the food simply can't reach them. So if you get food to someone, they won't starve to death. That's why it's not particularly complicated.
But the crisis is only getting worse. Massive streams of refugees are overwhelming neighboring countries. Uganda's Bidibidi camp now holds 800,000 people, making it the largest refugee camp in the world. Overcrowded camps are breeding grounds for disease, and cholera outbreaks have been reported across the entire region. It's why humanitarian groups are struggling to keep up. The UN reports that it needs $4.4 billion to address the famines, and they've only raised 14% of that thus far. But if the conflicts that are driving these famines aren't addressed, no amount of aid will solve these man-made crises.